are so many Stephen King ranking lists. What we need is a meta list. One list to rule them all. So I made the ultimate Stephen King ranking list. I scoured the internet, found 19 sources from websites, blogs, YouTube channels, and Reddit threads to compile the definitive list of 77 Stephen King novels. And honestly, I couldn't believe some of the books that made it into the top 10, including an epic battle for the #1 spot.
I don't want to be in a battle.
But I'm not talking about all 77 novels, you're crazy. But I'll share with you some things that blew me away. If you can do 2 things at once, the books will be scrolling on the side. If not, you can just download the full list at the link below. Roadwork and Cell are the 2 lowest rated King books. If you're in the mood for something short, the shortest Stephen King novel is 168 pages, and that is The Cycle of the Werewolf. But don't expect anything good, because it's nearly at the bottom of this list, followed closely by The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is the worst ranked Dark Tower series book. The best? Well, it's in the top 10, so you're just gonna have to wait. Tell me in the comments if you have guesses. If you're wondering what all the starred books are on the list, those are all the books that have been adapted for either film or TV. Mr. Mercedes is the first book in the Billy Hodges detective trilogy, and the highest rated book of the 3. He does have a children's book called Charlie the Choo Choo, which also happened to foreshadow everyone's favorite villain, Blaine the Drain. The first novel King wrote was Carrie in 1974, and it holds up really well. Salem's Lot and Needful Things would have made the top 10 in other iterations of this list, but the way I decided to average the data took them out of the running. But Melanie, everyone's lists have a different number of books on them. There's no way this could possibly work. How did you even calculate the data? Well, what a good question, troll me. I took all the lists, I standardized them, but that seemed to take into account both popularity and ranking, so then I decided to normalize them and then average them. Is it the right way? Well, I'm no mathematician, but since this is the definitive list, it must be the right way.
Is that definitive enough for you?
And now we arrive at the top 10. Just kidding, it's a top 11. So it turns out there's a nonfiction book in the top 10, which I think some people are gonna argue doesn't count. So I'm throwing in number 11, plus it's the only short story collection to make the top 10. 11. And that book is Night Shift. It includes a bunch of stories that have been made into movies. Children of the Corn, The Boogeyman, Graveyard Shift, and Maximum Overdrive, to name a few. So The Green Mile falls at number 10. And have you seen the movie? Because it is incredible, but it is also one of those movies that you just see one time and then you're like, I ain't never seen that movie again, because it's just so sad and depressing. Because of that, I don't know that you'll ever catch me reading this book, but if it's anything like the movie, I'm sure it's an incredible read. Number 9 is a book that I've never heard of, but now I really want to read it. And that book is Duma Key. And it could be the most underrated Stephen King book on the list, but the people have spoken and the people love it. Number 8 is the infamous nonfiction book, and the first book Stephen King published after being hit by a van and nearly killed. His memoir, On Writing, is a look into the work habits that have made Stephen King successful, as well as his writing advice for aspiring writers. Number 7 is The Drawing of the Three. This is the second Dark Tower book and the only Dark Tower book to make the top 10. Did you guess it? I will show you all the Dark Tower rankings on the screen really quick so that you can have a brawl in the comments. Number 6 is not only the most depressing book on the top 10, but probably the most depressing book that King has ever written. It is so depressing that he didn't even want to publish it. After King wrote Pet Sematary, he wanted to lock it in a drawer forever, but he had to turn in a novel to a publisher, and this was the only one he had ready. Nowadays, it's considered one of his most beloved novels, but King says he still wishes he never published it because it just spirals down into darkness. It seems to be saying that nothing is worth it, and I don't really believe that. Okay, now this, number 5, is the most surprising thing to me that happened on this entire top 10. It and The Stand were battling it out for the number 1 spot with critic reviews. 1, 2, 1, 2. I didn't know what was gonna happen, but then I added in people reviews. The YouTubers, the bloggers, the Redditors.
That changes everything.
The people reviews were so much lower than the critic reviews that they spun this book all the way from the number 1 or number 2 spot to number 5. That book is The Stand, which also happens to be King's longest novel, clocking in at 1,152 pages. Number 4 is Misery, which follows a deranged fan and a writer. One of the inspirations for this one came after King published his YA epic fantasy novel, The Eyes of the Dragon. Because that novel was fantasy and not horror, when it came out, fans were furious. The main character of Misery, Paul Sheldon, feels chained to the Misery books by his fans, and this is actually a metaphor for King feeling chained to writing horror fiction. Number 3 was inspired by a trip King took with his wife to the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, and that book is The Shining. The book and the movie are quite different, and we're never gonna come to a consensus as to which is better, but controversial opinion, I kinda love them both. but for different reasons. Number 2 is 11/22/63, which is the most recently published novel to make the top 10. It follows a time traveler who tries to prevent the JFK assassination. Stephen King originally had this idea in 1971, which is even before he wrote Carrie, but at the time he didn't want to do all of that research, so he didn't return to it until much later. And now we have reached number 1, which probably isn't a surprise to anyone, but it is the novel It. It was originally going to be a troll inspired by Three Billy Goats Gruff, but at some point Stephen King realized that clowns are just universally scary. Most people agree that this novel could be a little bit better with some editing, but hey, the same can be said for most Stephen King novels. Regardless, it remains at the top of most lists, both critically acclaimed and loved by the people. And now you never have to search the internet for your next Stephen King read because you have just seen the definitive list.